Hello, Rose. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you too, Susan.
Why don't you introduce yourself so people know about you in the Newberry Library?
Sure, absolutely. My name is Rose Miron. I am the Vice President for Research and Education at the Newberry Library. And I have been on staff at the Newberry for just over 6 years. But prior to the role I'm in now, was the director of the Darcy McNichol Center for American Indian and Indigenous Studies for five and a half years. So have been in a couple of places and have really just loved being part of this institution. For those that might not be familiar, the Newberry is a research library that is open to the public, but is an independent library that relies on donations and the support of the folks who use us to continue to support our work. And of course, we also rely on various grants for the kind of work that we do. The Newberry was founded in 1887, and it was founded using funds from the will of a man named Walter L. Newberry, who was a Chicago business person. And he speculated in a lot of the land that had recently been dispossessed from Native people, and made a lot of money in the real estate industry in Chicago. And in his will, he dictated that if his children did not have descendants, that the money in his will should be used to fund a free and open library for the public. And so the trustees of his will decided to fund the Newberry as an independent research library. At that point, the Chicago Public Library had already been founded, and so they really wanted this to be a place where scholars, but also members of the public might be interested, could come and explore rare books and documents and maps. So today we have quite a large collection. Our collection is, very print-based, as I mentioned. So we don't, it's particularly in terms of like our collection in American Indian and Indigenous Studies, which is one of our collection strengths. We don't have the kinds of artifacts that you would find in a lot of museums that have Native American collections. Our collection is limited to books related to Native history, original archival documents and materials, ranging from administrative records to correspondence, to firsthand accounts from individual people. And of course, maps, photographs, other kinds of print materials. As I mentioned, we have a number of different collection strengths, but the one, of course, that I'm most familiar with and the one I think we're most concerned with today is our collection in American Indian and Indigenous Studies. And that collection started with a donation from a man named Edward E. Ayer in 1911. And it has since grown much more since Ayer endowed the collection. So we continue to collect materials and, of course, to work with partners in the Native community, both tribal nations and individual Native researchers, and the local community here in Chicago, to make sure that those materials are accessible and can be used for projects that are important to Native communities.
Wow, I knew it was old. What year was it founded?
1887.
1887. I mean, that's still relatively young with the birth of Chicago.
Yes, and actually, it's right around the period of the Chicago World's Fair, and at a time when Chicago is kind of coming into its own, if you will.
And what about the building? It's in this postcard behind me. Was that
Yeah.
also founded or was that building designed for the new library?
So the building was designed for the library.
Okay.
And if I'm remembering my years correctly, this building was opened in 1887, and the actual library was founded just a few years before that. So this has been where the Newberry has been since 1887.
Well, I'm just so thrilled that you were available to talk today because the Newberry was so important in the beginning of my research.
Hmm.
And the very first podcast my husband and I are on, and he talks about when we were just dating. It was a
Oh.
rainy night or a rainy day, and we were looking for something to do. So we went to the Newberry Library. And that's where this whole journey started. It was well before we moved to the Sauganash neighborhood. It was well before I even knew about Billy Caldwell, but I was interested in Chicago. And so I went to the History Museum, and this must have been 1990, 91, before the internet. And so we came in and had to put on the white gloves and pulled some manuscripts and the books. And It was just so instrumental in the beginning of learning about Chicago.
That's wonderful. I'm so glad to hear that. It's always, I think one of the really unique things about the Newberry is that, anybody can use the collections. There's no requirement to have any kind of degree or research experience. You don't even really have to have a specific research project. You can just be interested in something as you were. And I think that often leads to discovering really wonderful things as it did with you. So I always love hearing stories like that.
Well, and the building is so beautiful. You walk in with the giant staircase, and the gift store has very unique items for Chicago for people for gifts for birthdays or holidays. And the parking is easy. You can just park right in front.
Yeah, there's actually quite a lot of street parking, shockingly.
Yeah. So the collection that you have, was it from Mr. Newberry, or would just the trust he left help you acquire the collection?
The trust that he left helped us acquire the collection.
Okay.
Newberry's materials were actually destroyed by the Great Chicago Fire. So
Oh,
he was like a collector who was interested in rare books, but his materials are not part of our collection because they were destroyed. So some of the original trustees of the Newberry's board are some of the people who donated the initial collections. For instance, Edward Ayer is one of those people. Um, but other collections have come in, at various points throughout the Newberry's history. And so there are certainly some folks who either have been trustees or are trustees who have donated large collections, but not every donor has been a trustee.
sure. And then Edward Ayer, was that really the beginning of the indigenous collection?
It was, yes. That was really the beginning of that collection. And he had collected materials for many, many years. And his collection did include some physical material culture, but those materials were donated to the Field Museum. So we have that kind of shared history of Ayer's collection with the Field
Right.
Museum. A lot of his material objects were donated there, and then he donated his books and his papers to us.
I remember researching some of his information. I don't remember specifics, but is it similar to the Draper collection in Wisconsin?
I haven't spent a ton of time in the Draper collection in Wisconsin, although from what I know about Draper, Draper was more of a historian himself, and so it's really like his papers and his research that are part of that collection. Is that right?
Yeah, it's not even actually first person, it's third person. So
Okay,
he records stories and he has some information. But I do remember reading information about um Chabonet and
sure.
Billy
Yeah.
Caldwell in your collection too.
Yeah, so Ayer was not actually going to a lot of Native communities and buying materials or like interviewing people himself, but he did buy things from people who were doing that, and he did send people into communities to collect information. So he himself was not like an anthropologist or an archaeologist by any means, but he was in contact with those type of people. And this kind of collecting is happening in a specific time period that we sort of now refer to as salvage anthropology. It's a moment in time where a lot of white collectors are really interested in collecting materials, papers, information, language, in some cases, human remains from indigenous communities. And sometimes that collection was done with consent, but a lot of times it wasn't. A lot of times you have collectors who are going into these communities and taking things either by force or with coercion. And so it's this really really ugly history, really, of collecting indigenous information and materials. And like I said, from what we know about Ayer, he wasn't the person who was actually going into communities and doing that collection, but he was purchasing things from people who were, and he certainly was in the mindset of a lot of people during that period, and that these white collectors erroneously thought that Native people were going to disappear. And so they really saw themselves as saviors of Native culture,
Of course.
rather in this very sort of paternalistic sense. And so I think that's really important when we talk about Ayer's legacy. I mean, I think we can be really happy that he donated these materials to the library and that they can now be used for research that is led by communities. But I think we also have to acknowledge that he was a part of this salvage anthropology moment, and that we know that at least some of the materials that he collected from people like anthropologists may have been collected with or without consent. And so we have to be really careful about that as we share information, as we work in the collections, and we want to. I think that's really part of why we try to do some of the reparative work that we do in terms of building reciprocal relationships with communities, because of that history. And I think that's really important when we think about that.
So that salvage era, what would the time frame be? Because you said era was around 1911, so would it be
Yeah.
that early 1900s?
Yeah, so I'd say late 1800s, early 1900s. So
Okay,
we're kind of at the turn of the century. The Chicago World's Fair often gets
right,
associated with this as well, because there's the kind of anthropology section of the World's Fair where Native culture is sort of put on display, in as a way to create contrast between Native cultures and so-called, American progress.
right. And when I think about the new work that's going on, the joint work that you have done with so many of the tribes in the Great Lakes area, I really feel like Newberry was really ahead of the curve on that, and really heard that kind of those discussions, those kind of exhibits coming from the Newberry more than any other organization in Chicago.
Oh, well, thank you. That's very kind of you. I mean, we are very lucky to have really wonderful staff here at the library, including several Indigenous staff members who I think have really played a key role in helping us do those things. We also were very fortunate to receive a planning grant from the Mellon Foundation in 2020 that helped us really develop a series of policies and protocols on how we work with these collections, how we work with Indigenous communities. And we now have, a strategic plan that is specific to Indigenous initiatives at the library. And we have specific staff that are dedicated to tribal outreach, and working with communities to ensure their access and sovereignty in the collection.
That's amazing, Rose. I mean, I don't want it to go unnoticed. I know the Field Museum's doing some things, some neighborhood things, but I mean, really to reach out, and it's in time intensive. It's labor intensive. It's, forward facing, meeting with people on a regular basis. And I know it's a labor of love, but I really want to compliment you on the effort that you've made over the past several years. The past 10 years for sure, maybe it's longer.
Yeah, thank you. We it's definitely going to be work that is going on for years to come.
Yeah.
The collection, I didn't say that much about the size of the collection at the beginning of our conversation when we were talking about the Newberry, but the collection as a whole is enormous. If you were to line up all of the shelves in the Newberry, it would be more than 27 miles of
Oh
books.
my
And
gosh.
so that of course isn't all American and Indigenous studies, but that collection is a very large collection. And so the time that it takes for our staff to go through all of those materials and just the number, I mean, we always say that the Indigenous Studies collection includes information about Indigenous people from pole to pole and coast to coast. And so we're talking about the entirety of North and South America. That's a huge number of Indigenous communities, and this work will probably go on long after I'm at the Newberry and long after I'm alive, because there's just so many communities whose histories are represented in our collection. But I try to see that as just thinking about it as becoming a regular part of our work rather than seeing it as discouraging, and just know that it will always kind of be something that we do, and just a part of our efforts.
I'd love to mention your work with the Prairie Band Potawatomi Nation. I know you work closely with Rayfield, and um, they got their land back recently.
Mhm.
But what types of initiatives are you working on that really help educate people about the people that used to live here? I mean, really
Sure.
used to live here, because of course we still have 150,000 Indigenous people that live in the state of Illinois. But what kind of work is Newberry doing?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the bulk of our work related to that is our Indigenous Chicago project, which is, I think, how we first got connected. So the Indigenous Chicago project is a multifaceted public history project about the Indigenous past, present, and future of Chicago. Um, And so there was an exhibition open at the Newberry in the fall of 2024.
which was
Um,
outstanding.
Oh, thank you. Um, and now that lives on through a website. And the website also has a number of different interactive maps that sort of recast Chicago as an Indigenous place. It includes curriculum for high school social studies, oral interviews with community members. And then we also did a series of public programs when the exhibition was open, and any recordings for those are available on the website as well. We also have things like resources for tour guides, and recommended readings, and a blog where we kind of post various updates about new information that we have. So it's a really robust website that has a lot of information about the Indigenous past, present, and future of Chicago. And the project really started with community conversations all the way back in 2019. It started with informal conversations, myself and other staff members of the Newberry having conversations with community members just about, what their priorities were, what were the kind of biggest challenges that Native people here in Chicago were facing. And I think the thing that we heard over and over again was that Native people who are living here felt invisible. They felt like people did not understand the nature of um, the Native population that lives here now, or the fact that this has always been an Indigenous place and that there have always been Indigenous people that have lived in the city that we now call Chicago. And so we started to think about what it would look like to put together some kind of public facing resource that could be created in close collaboration with community members, both folks who live here now and the tribal nations like Prairie Band, who were removed but still hold connections to this place, and how we could think about this being kind of an ongoing resource that we could continue to add to and continue to update, and really have it be something that tribes and Native community members felt comfortable pointing people to as they were getting inquiries about this history. So that's kind of how Indigenous Chicago emerged. And then we started holding community meetings in early 2020. Of course, we moved them online into the pandemic, and then reached out to tribal nations like Prairie Band, and started working with them on the development of this project. So the project was overseen by an advisory group of about 25 Native community members, tribal representatives, and Indigenous scholars. And that advisory group was split up into 5 subcommittees for each of the project components that I mentioned earlier. And those subcommittees, some of them met as frequently as twice a month to help develop all of these resources and review them. So it was a really robust effort and really a giant group project, if you will,
It really
to
was.
put all of this together. But I think, the collaboration with tribal nations, I think, was one of the most crucial parts of the project, because there's a lot in the Newberry collection that we can use to interpret the history of this place, by centering Indigenous people, but there's only so much that we can get from the materials themselves. We really have to talk to the living descendants of people, because tribal knowledge and Indigenous protocols and just information that these communities hold about their own ancestors. There's just so much of that lies outside of archival documents, and so I think that collaboration was a really huge part of the project. And of course, as I said at the beginning, we wanted to make sure that this was a resource that community members themselves felt really confident about pointing people to and using as a resource in their own work. And, as I mentioned before, we have several Indigenous folks on staff, and the project itself was co-directed by 4 people: myself, Ana Maria Lopez, who's our Indigenous Studies librarian and assistant curator for American Indian and Indigenous Studies, Meredith McCoy, who is an assistant professor at Carleton College, and Blair Morceau, who's an assistant professor at Michigan State University. And everybody on that leadership team, except for me, is Native. And so we really wanted to make sure that the project itself was, mostly led by Native people, that the advisory group was Native community members, and that we were really trying to elevate and center Native voices really just across the entire project.
And what I love about that project is you do capture the Indigenous voice and perspective, and it's a different perspective. I'm also non-native, and it's a
Mhm.
different perspective, different words, different choice of words, different lens that they view life through. and this with these ancestral stories that they bring with them. So you definitely capture that. And the other thing I loved about your Indigenous Chicago exhibit in the online version too is you take 200 years and create a story. And that's
Mhm.
not easy to do. And, to the very beginning to the why Chicago, why Indigenous, why now. And then lastly, you add in this contemporary element, with I call it the comic that you did
Mhm.
because it's a very contemporary element. And I know with the Billy Caldwell movie, we often get people that, first off, they'll say, I didn't realize that there were still Native Americans in Chicago. So you
Mhm.
actually help tell that story with people's personal stories and the photos you do of contemporary people living here today. And I just think you just nailed it. You really,
Oh.
it's just terrific.
Well, thank you. Thank you. We're really proud of the project, and we're really, really grateful to everybody who worked with us on it because it would not have been possible without the full team.
Well, I'm on the board at the Gitchigami Indigenous Nations Museum, so we're going to be, we purchased that from you, and so I'm so excited it will have a legacy after with from the Newberry.
Me too, because I think, one of the things I remember when we first started talking about the exhibition and community members were like, wait a second, we're going to put in all this work for this exhibition to be open for 3 months. And, we of course were like, well, we're going to have the website and like that will be the living, the living legacy of the project and we'll continue to update that. And that's all still true and that's great. But I think it will be so exciting to have a continued physical place that people can go to learn about this history because I think one of the reasons that we tried to design the project as we did to have these multiple facets is because different people learn in different ways. Some people want to go through an exhibition. Some people want to look at a story map. Some people want to, look at our digital maps and go through each point. Some people want to go on a walking tour, So I think we tried to have multiple different ways that people could engage with this information.
When previously we were called the Mitchell Museum of the
Hmm.
American Indian, and we went through a strategic planning, it was about 3 years ago, it was during COVID, and we did a name change, but we also very strategically narrowed our mission, and it's from the pole to pole Indigenous nations, and we narrowed it down to Great Lakes tribes,
Hmm.
and which includes many of the nine, U.S. federal Potawatomi tribes. But we've also found that people that come in our museum, and I'm wondering if they do the same thing at the Newberry, a lot of people want to know about where they live. So if they
Hmm.
live maybe in Skokie, what tribes were here? Where are the historic sites? What were the trails that went through Skokie here? And I know we get that often in the Gitchigami Museum, but what about Newberry? Do you get a lot of people that are interested in how it affects them locally?
We do, yeah. I mean, a lot of people want, I think a way that a lot of people engage with history in general is by thinking about how it relates to them in the present day, right? And that's why we study history, because we want to understand how the past relates to our present and how it can change the way that we live in the present. And so we do get a lot of people who are interested in specific areas that they live. We get a lot of people who are interested in the kind of general history of Chicago. And I think that's really one of the ways that I think that's one of the reasons I think that Indigenous Chicago has been so captivating for people and it's been so interesting is because people can find something within the project that relates to their own life and or at least find places that they recognize and understand that there's an Indigenous history to those places.
What else? What do you have new coming up at the Newberry that you're working on?
Well, we have an exhibition open right now on called Native Pop, which is
Yeah.
all about Indigenous engagements in pop culture. I did not help curate that, but it's a really wonderful exhibition that is going to be closing here soon. So I would definitely encourage folks who are interested to check that out. because it's a great representation of the work that we do. Just in terms of kind of where the Indigenous Chicago Project is going and what's coming up on that front, our biggest focus right now is continuing the oral history work of the project. Thus far, we've conducted oral histories with over 50 individuals in the
Wow.
native Chicago community, or people who used to live in Chicago but have now moved elsewhere. So we're continuing to do that. Community members have told us that that's a really big priority for them. And so we're continuing to do that work, both like the interviewing, but also, of course, like the transcribing and like getting people to review their interview transcripts and making sure everything looks appropriate to them. So that's a big part of the work that we're doing right now. And then we did just receive some funding. We're very fortunate to receive funding from the Terra Foundation for parts of the Indigenous Chicago exhibition and programming. And they actually awarded us another grant after the launch of the project to continue doing the community engagement. So we are going to be, using that funding to host more community meetings in the upcoming year, especially that we're coming up on a year since the project launched. And so we really want to talk with people about, how are you seeing this project work? Like what else do you want to see that's not on the website? Is there anything that you would want to change? Really start to get kind of feedback as to how people are using this, and what they'd like to see from it in the future. So that's really our focus right now, is to kind of move back into listening mode, and ask people what they're interested in. With a project that is this large, I think there were lots of things that came up during our conversations over the last, 5 years, that we were like, that sounds great, but we can't do it by September 2024. And so I think now is the time that we want to kind of revisit some of those ideas, and really just think about what the future of this project looks like based on the priorities of community members.
Thank you for your leadership. I can't think of another organization that is providing such a neutral and safe place for
Oh, thank you.
everybody to have these conversations. And I really encourage people to visit the Newberry, support it, join as a member, and go into your collections on a rainy day.
A rainy day it's a great rainy day activity for sure.
For sure. And I just want to thank you for all your help with the Billy Caldwell movie, and Joshua, who's in the movie too, because the knowledge that you two brought was really helpful and really kind of brought it a contemporary sense to, how things are working today with the tribe. So thank you, Rose.
Oh, absolutely. It was a pleasure to be involved. And it was so wonderful for me to be able to hear Joshua really speak about all that he learned, because he did spend time in the Draper collection. He did go to the Chicago History Museum and look at some of those materials. And so I think it was great to hear his perspective on that. And as an Indigenous person, Joshua was able to also just bring an additional lens to interpreting that information. I was always really, really struck just by hearing him talk about the way that Caldwell would have seen some of the horrific genocidal violence that happened in his childhood, where he grew up, and how that would have impacted the way that he understood interactions with the American government when he was in Chicago. And so I think, it's that kind of information that lives outside of archival materials. And so I'm forever grateful for the perspective that he brought to the project, and brought to those materials.
I couldn't agree more. He was our breakout star. I was watching him, and he really he really articulated it in a way that no one else did.
Yeah.
And I am so grateful for him too.
Yeah, me too. And he did a lot of great work on the rest of the project as well. With
Yeah.
especially with there's one of the maps on the website, is our landscape change maps, and it kind of recreates what the landscape of Chicago looked like in the 1830s, prior to some of the major changes that happened in the landscape shortly after the removal of Indigenous people. And I think, one of the points that we try to make through the project is to say, all of these sort of engineering feats that Chicago has been celebrated for in its history were really only made possible by the dispossession of Indigenous people, and in many cases destroyed this very important ecosystem that Indigenous people had designed their lives around. And so it's really interesting to go back and look at that map and just see how much the landscape of Chicago has changed, and really think about that in the history of settler colonialism and the story of settler colonialism in this place.
That map is super important, and also the map that you have up where you can find indigenous sites around the Chicago
Yeah.
area.
Yes.
And even the Wilmette House. I mean,
Hmm.
you guys really did a lot of research. I don't know, did you all have to walk around and find all those? But it's really comprehensive.
Yeah, I mean, it's still in progress. There's definitely still sites that we want to get added to that map. But I think that's one of my favorite maps too, because again, I think people can look at it and find places that they are familiar with or that are close to where they live. And I think
Yes.
making those connections is really important in helping everybody understand that, you know, if you live in Chicagoland, you live on land that was dispossessed from Native people, in some cases through treaties, and in some cases land that was actually created after these treaties were signed and remains unceded. And so I think helping people understand that, you know, the city of Chicago could not exist without the dispossession of Native people, and that we have all benefited from that is really important in just thinking how we move into the future and how we support Indigenous priorities and reclamations of this land in various ways.
I couldn't say it any better. Thank you, Rose.
Sure thing.
What is your website so people can go to it and see these resources, but also find out about membership?
Sure. The website for Indigenous Chicago is indigenous-chicago.org. And all of the, you know, various things that I've talked about with the project can be found on that page. And the website for the Newberry is just newberry.org. And you can find out more there about visiting the library, visiting our reading rooms, attending various public programs, adult education seminars that we run. And of course, you can learn more about becoming a member and donating to support the work that we do.
Beautiful. Thank you, Rose.
You're welcome. Thank you, Susan.